Good evening. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's very special lung cancer living room, coming to you live from Fenway Park in Boston. I am thrilled to be here. For those of you who may not know who I am Danielle Hicks. I am Chief Patient Officer at Go-To for Lung Cancer. Tonight, we're going to be talking about and exploring the genetics of lung cancer. A lot of us in the room, either working in lung cancer, living with lung cancer, or caring for someone with lung cancer, know that we've worked really hard at identifying risk factors, but in my very humble opinion, we don't know enough. So tonight, we're going to take this deeper dive into the INHERIT study, which is a study being done through the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in collaboration with Go-To for Lung Cancer and Alchemy, the Adario Lung Cancer Medical Institute. So when we think about lung cancer, we often wonder why and how it develops. And I know in the, going on 20 years or so that I've been working personally with people diagnosed and their loved ones, it's always a question, or it's quite often a question, like, how did I get this? Why did I get this? And unlike other, cancers, like breast and colon, we rarely think about our genetics. We quite often hear in breast cancer about family histories, about the BRCA gene, what people need to look out for, but we don't talk about it, or we don't know enough about it as it pertains to lung cancer. And that's really what we're hoping to sort of uncover through this study and really bring the greater lung cancer community information about today. So our speakers, we have Dr. Jaclyn Piccolo here to my left. She's attending physician from Dana-Farber, an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. And in addition to seeing patients regularly, Dr. Piccolo studies genetic risk for lung cancer and is the lead investigator on the INHERIT study. We are thrilled to have her here tonight, so thank you, Jackie. And then Diane Koeller, who is a senior genetic counselor also at the Dana-Farber here in Boston, and her research areas include hereditary lung cancer, transgender inclusive healthcare, and cancer genetic access in Africa, which is a really broad area to cover, and good for you. She's a leading genetic counselor on the INHERIT study and was previously lead genetic counselor on the original INHERIT EGFR study from 2016 to 2018 with Dr. Jeff Oxnard, right? We are thrilled to have her here today. And then Go-To's very own Dr. Courtney Granville, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at Go-To. Courtney, before joining the nonprofit sector about 5 years ago, she spent 25 years studying the mechanisms underlying the early development of lung cancer and other cancers for the purpose of studying chemo-preventative strategies in high-risk populations. These are so many words and why I hate reading all of this. And it's why I'm going to jump right into my very next question, because it's, I think, so much more meaningful for the people in the room and those watching from their own homes to hear from them who they are and why lung cancer matters. Let's get started. And Dr. Piccolo, let's start with you. Why is lung cancer an area of focus for you?
Sure. Thanks. So I've had an interest in lung cancer from an early age, scientifically and personally. I had a close family friend who was diagnosed with lung cancer at the age of 48, who unfortunately passed away. But their story kind of sparked an interest for me in lung cancer over 20 years ago now, which has certainly grown as the field has evolved. But as a younger person, after college, I spent a few years at the NCI studying mechanism and drug development in lung cancer. And then after that, went to med school and did a PhD in cancer genetics and biology. And then after that, did a medical residency and then came to Dana-Farber for oncology fellowship, where I knew I wanted to study lung cancer. And I was very fortunate to have worked with Dr. Yanni, who could not, Pasi Yanni, who could not, wasn't available to join us today. But kind of during the course of that work, I was struck by what they call the phenotypic extremes of lung cancer, both in those that are very young when they're diagnosed and those who haven't had kind of significant tobacco exposure that we usually see with people developing lung cancer. And so that kind of led me to wonder if there's a genetic risk component to this, either that is kind of acting alone or is acting in concert with the environment, things we don't typically think about. So I realized that this was an area where I could kind of study this and merge my kind of personal and professional interests.
So I first got involved with the Inherit study in 2016, and I lovingly say that I was voluntold to participate in the study. The genetic counselor who was working on it previously was leaving. I was kind of the lowest on the totem pole, and nobody else had volunteered, so I became the genetic counselor on the study. But I very quickly fell in love with it and really felt like there was so much important misinformation out there for providers on hereditary lung cancer. When I was trained as a genetic counselor, we were told to basically ignore lung cancer in family histories and just move on and not really take it into our risk assessment at all. So being involved in the Inherit study really opened my eyes up to all the misinformation that was out there. So I became very passionate about educating other healthcare providers on inherited lung cancer risk and also helping to do what I could to further the research and identify more families at risk and more genes that are playing a role in inherited lung cancer risk.
Thanks, Diane. Take it away, Courtney.
Amazing stories to follow. My interest in lung cancer really stems from the influence of tobacco and being very interested in trying to better understand how smoking actually causes lung cancer, what it actually does within the DNA of cells to cause cancer. I also became very interested through studying those mechanisms and why not every smoker gets lung cancer, how other environmental exposures can cause lung cancer, and why some people who seemingly have no risk factors are getting lung cancer. So for me, really on the intellectual side, trying to understand how environmental exposures are causing cancer to develop. I also was caregiver for my mom, who was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer at the age of 52. She lived for 16 years with her disease. So really seeing what it takes to be a patient and be a survivor also instilled the sense of wanting to do more and wanting to bring the science closer to patients and really kind of bring that all together. So I've been at GoTo now for a year leading our research team. Feel very lucky to have been able to step into the legacy of Inherit and get to work with these fabulous scientists on this study.
Thanks, Courtney. And with that, I think we're just going to jump right in because we have a lot to cover tonight. And I want to make sure that we give this topic the time it deserves. So, Dr. Piccolo, can you explain a little bit about what we know today insofar as what the risk factors are for lung cancer?
Yes. So, I mean, by and large, we know that lung cancer is related to tobacco use or tobacco exposure. That's true, still remains true for the majority of lung cancers in the U.S. and around the world. But also in the U.S. and globally, certainly, we know that there is an increasing proportion of lung cancer that is arising in people who have never smoked. And that's not to say on an absolute level that those cancers are increasing, because we don't know that. What we do know is that kind of proportionally, the percentages are changing as smoking rates are declining. The proportion of people who have not smoked is expanding and getting lung cancer. And so from a genetic perspective, tobacco-related lung cancer, there definitely are some associations that have come out over the past 15 or 20 years. And these kind of center largely around smoking behavior and nicotine metabolism. And it's kind of only more recently people have started to look at kind of non-tobacco-related lung cancer and genetic associations there. And generally speaking, those findings have been kind of non-overlapping, which is probably, not unexpected. And that we know for both types of lung cancer that having a family history of lung cancer raises your risk, particularly a first-degree relative, but certainly even going further beyond than that, there's an increased risk there as well. And to Courtney's point, not every person who smokes gets lung cancer, right? And then there are some people that never smoke and never have kind of your typical exposures and get it anyway. From an environmental perspective, certainly more recently, there's been a lot of interest and research around air pollution, fine particulate matter, certainly radon, which we know has been linked to lung cancer for a long time, both in people who have smoked and who have not. Around the world, people are looking now at indoor cooking fumes and kind of cooking behaviors and things that there may be exposures there that we don't entirely understand, but certainly in Asia, those have been known for a while. So kind of, from a genetic and environmental perspective, I think where our work together kind of comes in is trying to link those two. So looking at genetic risk, but also how does that interplay with the environment and explain why some people get lung cancer and some people don't.
Yeah, thank you. I think, one of the things too, when I think about our veteran population and chemical exposures and burn pits and all of those things.
Totally.
Yeah. And I think it makes me incredibly happy that we're talking about this now instead of just talking about smoking, which for decades was sort of what we did, which is where the stigma and this shame blame became attached to this diagnosis. And I want one of you to correct me if my statistic is wrong or if it's changed, but 20% of smokers will develop lung cancer, 20%, right? 80% will ultimately get some sort of heart disease. And there's no shame blame there. In fact, we've had really incredible medical breakthroughs when it comes to somebody who's suffering from heart disease. So this topic, if I'm just trying to drive my point home, it's because I'm trying to drive my point home, is incredibly important to me. And we'll talk about the personal aspects of that a little bit later, but not just for the personal aspects, but for the countless numbers of people that I've talked to over the last 2 decades, whether they have a smoking history or do not. I think that stigma has been directly related to how long it's taking us to know more. With that, Diane, I'm going to go to you. Does lung cancer run in families? And if it does, how common is it?
Yeah, so we definitely can see lung cancer running through families. There is some familial risk. I think we're understanding it more as time goes on because the research has been pretty limited to date. But we know that if you have a family member with lung cancer, your risk is slightly elevated compared to somebody who doesn't have a family member with lung cancer, especially if you're related to somebody who had never smoked cigarettes and developed a lung cancer, your risk is going to be slightly increased. We've seen this even with third-degree relatives of somebody with a never smoker's lung cancer. We think some of this might be caused by shared environmental factors in families or shared lifestyle factors, shared smoking habits within families, but there definitely is a genetic component that we're understanding more as time goes on. But we do think it's rare still to have a true inherited high-risk mutation increasing your risk for lung cancer.
And is that, and I'm going to pivot back to you, Dr. Piccolo, is that because we just don't know enough? What Diane just said about there's no high-risk factor.
I think it's a lot of things. One is we don't know enough about some of those high risk, in other words, genes or variants in genes that are imparting some of this risk. Some of those may have yet to be discovered, and we can talk about the inherit study is trying to look at that as well. The other possibility is that it's, not one big change in one gene, but maybe a lot of small changes in many genes. And so that's what we call polygenic risk. And people are looking at that now too. We are also looking at that. And so I think as genetics in lung cancer kind of gets explored, we'll uncover more of this. But or it may be that there just, aren't that many kind of high risk familial lung cancers.
Which is why where this conversation is going a little later in this study is so incredibly important. Diane, I want to go back to you. So with all of that being said, are there any genes that predispose?
Yep. Yeah, so far there's only been a few genes identified as genes where if you have one mutation in this gene that's inherited, you have a significantly increased risk for lung cancer. These are mostly EGFR, ERBB2, and TP53. So those are the main high-risk inherited genetic risk factors. Some other genes we're kind of taking a look at. There's been some studies showing there might be a slightly increased lung cancer risk for genes like the BRCA2 gene and the ATM gene, which are more often associated with breast cancer risk and are often tested in the context of familial breast cancer. But there have been some studies indicating there may be a slight impact on lung cancer risk with those genes. So that's another thing we're looking at with the INHERIT study.
I'm going to pivot back to you and take maybe a little bit of time and a deeper dive into discussing how the genes we inherit are different than biomarkers.
So when you have a tumor, that tumor has kind of arisen out of kind of years or a lifetime's worth of mutations that it's acquired to become a tumor. And so those mutations can also be known as biomarkers. Those mutations can only be found in the tumor. They're not, you weren't born with them, they can't be passed on to children. They're kind of only found in the tumor. So when you have a biopsy for biomarker testing, that the tumor is only being tested there, and that's what we call a tissue biopsy. Or you can have what's known as a liquid biopsy or blood-based testing, or ctDNA is often called. And that kind of testing, what that's testing is a tumor, if there are enough cancer cells in the body, may shed its DNA into the bloodstream. And so when that happens, these kind of assays can detect that tumor-related DNA. But again, it's DNA that's coming directly from the tumor, and it's not DNA that's kind of making up every cell and every tissue in your body. And so these mutations were never inherited, and they can't be passed down. So that's in contrast to inherited mutations. We also use the word germline, which you might see online or in some other contexts. And those are mutations you're born with, meaning you likely inherited from mom or dad, and can be passed down to children. And these mutations, the way that we test for them is usually a blood test or a saliva test. And that testing is looking for, not for tumor cells, but just for, if it's a blood test, just looking for normal circulating white blood cells, like the ones that fight off infection in the bloodstream. And so we look for mutations there. And if it's a saliva test, just kind of scraping the mouth or looking in saliva. And so that's very different than tumor testing. It gets a little bit tricky because some of the assays that are designed to sequence tumors can also pick up some of these germline mutations, kind of like on the side. But the tests themselves were not designed for that. And so from a patient perspective, if that happens, it kind of really bears a discussion with your oncologist to figure out kind of which of those mutations are which and what the implications are there. But generally speaking, if you have a biomarker test and it finds an EGFR mutation or an ALK rearrangement, those are mutations that happened only in the tumor. And you won't find those in germline testing, and you won't pass those down to children and that kind of thing.
We talked about spit tests, and so when we're talking about blood biopsies versus tumor or tissue biopsies, are you saying the same thing for a tissue biopsy as a blood biopsy?
Yeah, if the blood biopsy was designed to be a tumor test, in other words, designed to pick up tumor cells or tumor DNA that's in the bloodstream. And those are fairly common. I think Foundation Medicine has one. Ardent is another company. There's some others out there, but certainly it's a common thing that patients will receive.
So there are tests specific to looking for these genetic or germline mutations that are, the assays or the way that they do these tests are completely different.
Yes, and in fact, it will specifically exclude any tumor DNA that might be in the bloodstream. And there's usually a panel of genes that are being kind of tested in these tests as well.
How do genetics potentially influence survival and response to therapy for people with lung cancer?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I think that there's two ways to look at genetic risk in lung cancer. The first way, or not two ways, but kind of two sets of information that you can get. I mean, the first kind of goal with it is How do we find people with genetic risk for lung cancer? How do we identify it and then employ screening and find tumors that are at earlier stages where we can treat them curatively either by surgery or some other way? So that's one way to use genetic risk in lung cancer. The second way is in cancers that have already developed, kind of what role does the underlying inherited genome play in response to treatment and the treatments that you would give patients. And I think certainly in other cancers like breast, ovarian, pancreatic cancer, this is much more well explored, where they are finding that certain inherited changes that people are born with that are also present in the tumor cells can be used to kind of predict response to certain treatments. And so that's the direction we would love to take this research with lung cancer, at least explore that and see whether it also holds true for lung cancer patients, but just not there yet.
So Diane, in jumping back to you, in the work that I've done, working with folks, we've heard people say that they don't necessarily want to have genetic testing because they're worried about how it could impact things in the future, such as either health insurance coverage or life insurance and that type of thing. Should they be worried?
Yeah, so we do have certain protections in place, and we hear this concern all the time. It's if you're getting genetic testing and meeting with a genetic counselor, this will almost definitely be part of the conversation that happens prior to the testing. So there's a federal law in place. It's called GINA. It stands for the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. This was passed in 2008, and it protects you against health insurance and employment discrimination based on genetic testing results. So under this law, a health insurance company cannot call a gene mutation a pre-existing condition. They cannot use it against you in any way. Employers are not allowed to ask if you've had genetic testing, cannot force you to disclose your genetic status. But this law does have some exceptions. So it doesn't apply to small employers of 15 people or less. It doesn't apply to the military. It also does not cover life insurance, long-term care insurance, or disability insurance. So often if we're seeing somebody for genetic testing, especially somebody who has not had a cancer diagnosis previously, we'll often encourage them to think about life insurance options prior to getting their germline genetic testing, just in case it would be used against them in the future. But it is common for sometimes people to decline testing for fears of how this could be used against them or for concerns that this law might not always exist. But so far, it's been in place since 2008. So we're hopeful that it will stay in place.
Diane, is that a national law or is that state by state?
It's a federal law. Some states do have extra state level protection, so it is always worth looking into your state legislation as well. So for instance, within Massachusetts, we do have some state level protection against life insurance discrimination. So it is something that can vary state by state.
Yeah, I know this is a big topic for a lot of folks right now, particularly just in the sort of the age or era that we're in with it from a technology standpoint and AI and all of these other all this other information being passed electronically and people being fearful about how that might impact. And that's not just lung cancer. I mean, that's sort of across the board. How can our understanding our genetics be helpful?
Yeah. So in the context of inherited cancer risk, it can be helpful to understand our genetic risk factors to learn if our risk for any type of cancer might be elevated beyond the average person's risk. And really the goal of this is to get you access to screening and prevention. So if your risk for lung cancer is higher than the average person's risk, maybe we should be thinking differently about screening for lung cancer in the goal of catching a lung cancer at the earliest possible stage if it ever develops, since generally in the general population, we're not screening folks for lung cancer. So that's really the main goal with the genetic testing piece of things and finding people who are at risk.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point because although screening for lung cancer has been available for quite a while now, it's really only those between 50 and 80 with a 20-pack-year history or who have quit, less than 15 years ago. So it's really heavily tied to smoking and not all of these other things that we're talking about today, which is why this stuff is so important. We need to open up those screening guidelines. And sadly, and again, and I hate to keep harping on the stigma piece, but when we look at the numbers nationally of even people within those qualifying criteria that are actually getting screened and then following through with any further diagnostics that may need to happen, It's 8% of roughly 16 million people in the United States. So I'm passionate about doing better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've had a really hard time getting insurance coverage for lung cancer screening for our mutation carriers, for our EGFR positives. It's a very frustrating point. I've had times when I've been disclosing an EGFR positive result to a patient, and they're like, oh, well, I guess I just should have smoked my whole life in order to get my CT screening, because they are just so frustrated with getting access to the screening.
Yeah, it's really tough. I know that it's tough for family members who don't have any known risk factors, but have one, two, or multiple generations of family members who have been diagnosed with this disease. You see where this is going? We're all jumping into the Inherit study and the origins here. Diane, can anyone get this type of testing?
So anybody can talk to their primary care provider. Is usually a good step to get a referral to a genetic counselor to talk more about genetic testing options. So typically, if you're meeting with a genetic counselor, we'll go through a complete medical history, draw out your family history, and take a look at what your risk would be expected to be for an inherited gene mutation and whether you would meet insurance criteria for testing. Most of our genetic testing guidelines do not include much for lung cancer at this point, unfortunately, so it can be a challenge to get genetic testing covered based on a family history of lung cancer, but sometimes we can get it covered under some other cancer type in the family and just include the lung cancer genes in the testing that we do. If we can't get insurance coverage for testing, typically it's accessible for about $250 as an out-of-pocket cost outside of insurance, and sometimes that can be on a sliding scale based on income, so we can often make it pretty accessible to most people.
So I know that the Dana-Farber and other large, particularly academic or large community, centers have genetic counselors, but maybe not every, place around the country does. So what would be the recommendation then?
Yeah, there are not a lot of us. There's, I think, about 3,000 cancer-specific genetic counselors in the country, and we tend to be pretty concentrated in cities. So in rural areas and just in some states, there's definitely not access to genetic counselors. You can look into telehealth options. So even if you're not near a city, there might be a genetic counselor within your state. We're typically licensed by state, so you might have telehealth availability with a genetic counselor, even if they're not super local to you, and the testing can typically be done with saliva that you can do right from home. Otherwise, I would just recommend talking to your primary care provider and see what options there are. Some primary care providers do feel comfortable ordering genetic testing, but some don't feel super confident in it just because it's not their area of expertise, but they should know where to direct you.
Yeah, and if you're still having trouble, shameless, not so shameless plug for GoTo, and the support services team is here to help. So, if you have questions or are looking for access to genetic counseling, near you or via telehealth, we are happy to help provide guidance in ensuring that we get you guys there. Let's talk a little bit about what GoTo is doing or trying to do to better understand the genetics of lung cancer.
Yeah, so Danielle, I think you know this as well as I do, but thank you for asking the question, giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about GoTo's interest in really understanding the origins of lung cancer. We've had an initiative for about a decade called the Origins Initiative, which has included actually several clinical studies as well as a number of observational and survey-based studies to better understand lung cancer risk. Our real interest, as you know, is in getting people screened and trying to understand who's at risk so we can expand the screening criteria, which we talked about a little bit. And so Inherit, which we will talk about, is a study that launched about a year ago. I think maybe Dr. Piccolo is going to tell us a little bit more about the specifics of that study. But we're really trying to bring together a group of people that can help us better understand risk factors other than smoking, also that can help us understand how our germline risk feeds into the development of lung cancer. And that's really what the Origins Initiative is all about. We've launched a risk survey this year within our lung cancer registry. That is a survey actually first of its kind at GoTo for lung cancer. It is for people who have lung cancer, but it's also for people who do not have lung cancer. It's for people who may have COPD, been exposed to perhaps wildfires or radon, or have other known exposures and think, I might be at risk. And the goal for us is really to follow these people longitudinally and see whether or not there's a higher incidence of lung cancer in some of these groups. So we're really excited about that study in the future. We hope to be able to add the possibility of imaging into some of those groups. We also are adding things like medical records and other tests that people may have available that they're interested in sharing for research purposes. So we're building maybe a bit of a mini data hub that would allow us to look at different types of data, including genetic data, and try to better understand the origins of lung cancer. So I guess that's been going on for a while. We're looking forward to seeing how we can extend it through the INHERIT study. I did want to mention one other thing, Danielle. I don't know if this is the right time for that, about our partnership with Alchemy. Do you think? Okay. So GO2 has partnered for quite a long time with a medical consortium called the Adario Lung Cancer Medical Institute. It's a very specialized institute that brings together academic researchers from over 20 large academic medical centers. The thing about Alchemy and GO2 and our partnership that's really unique is that we actually enable studies to reach patients where they are. We have a direct-to-patient model. We also do what's called decentralized research, where we may be able to work with hospitals, traditional patient, direct-to-patient care centers, and large academic medical centers to go into those environments and bring people into our studies out of environments that wouldn't normally get to participate in research. So by going direct to patient, and by also going to these care centers that are in remote settings, we're actually able to reach more people and reach a population of people that don't usually get to participate in research and clinical trials. Only about 7% of Americans participate in clinical research. It's a really low number. But there's a lot of reasons for that. So we're trying to reduce some of those barriers by making research more accessible in that partnership with Alchemy. So hopefully that'll come up a little bit more in the specific discussion of INHERIT and what all that's about.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about Alchemy's partnership. You want to talk a little bit about the partnerships with DFCI?
Yeah, so GO2 really sort of sits at the nexus of all of the partners that it takes to bring a big research study together, I guess, so to speak. So you mentioned the epidemiology of young lung cancer. That's a partnership with the University of Southern California. We have also had a long-standing relationship with Dana-Farber and the Cancer Center there, and I believe that kicked off maybe a decade ago with the Genomics of Young Lung Cancer study. And then that bled into a study that discovered the EGFR T790M mutation in EGFR, which I already said. And then that's led us to INHERIT. And so this has actually been a long-standing collaboration between GO2, Alchemy, and Dana-Farber, and specifically Pasiani's lab, and then a number of other wonderful medical oncologists and researchers who have been a part of these studies.
Thanks, Courtney. And I know you touched a little bit on sort of INHERIT-1 or the EGFR T790M study. I was talking about it a little bit earlier tonight, and that was that study in particular, well, all of them really, but that one, as it relates to tonight's discussion, I think was really relevant in the role that GO2 was able to play in speaking with, people who had family members who were diagnosed, but they didn't have any known risk factors, and we were able to guide them towards this study. And Diane, I think you actually worked on that study 10 or so years ago.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
So I counseled about half the patients who were on that study.
Yeah,
So
I love it. Okay, so now I want to jump into the INHERIT study itself. And Jackie, can you tell us a little bit about INHERIT, who can participate, and what we're hoping to learn from the study?
So the INHERIT study, which stands for Investigating Hereditary Risk in Thoracic Cancers, is kind of a multi-pronged study. I think the overriding goal of the study is to kind of understand genetic risk in lung cancer, kind of break that down into populations that may have inherited risk for different reasons, and to follow people over time. And this includes people who have lung cancer and also people who don't, people who are probably relatives of people who have had lung cancer, but we think may also have inherited risk. And so we have kind of endpoints built into the study where we're looking at germline or inherited genetics. So like we mentioned, a blood sample, blood test. We're also looking at, in the cases of people who have lung cancer, looking at changes in the tumors that happen in this context, and then also, collecting a lot of data in the form of surveys to kind of correlate these changes with things like environmental exposures, treatment-related data, if someone's had treatment, medical history, other risk factors, things that we currently don't really take into account when we do this kind of research. So the study itself has a couple of parts. The first part consists of a blood sample, and so people can enroll anywhere in the United States. There's a study website to go to if you're interested, to see if you'd be eligible, and I'll talk about the eligibility criteria in a minute, but just kind of the bones of the study is there's a blood sample, so there's a remote phlebotomist company that will come to your house and draw the blood sample. Alternatively, we're now at the stage where people can go to a Quest lab or something like this and have the sample drawn. It's sent back to Dana-Farber, and that testing consists of two parts. The first part is kind of included in consenting to the research study, which is a research sample, which goes to the research study team, so myself and others. And that is a sample that we're doing whole genome sequencing on. Again, de-identified, never traced back to any individual person, but results are kind of aggregated among groups so we can find common genetic changes, which is what we need. We need numbers in these situations because these genetic changes are rare. And so to find them, we need to kind of look amongst large groups of people. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is an optional piece, but we're finding most participants choose, and this is kind of what Diane was alluding to, which is clinical germline testing. So it's a panel of genes. It's done by a clinical laboratory, and it tests for kind of genes that we know predisposed to either lung cancer or other cancers. Things like BRCA1 and 2 and TP53 and things people might be more familiar with. And so that comes with a report that can be used for clinical decision making, and also comes with the option to have any family members tested from anyone who was positive, and then to receive genetic education from Diane and a number of other genetic counselors, and then if you live within Massachusetts, the opportunity for genetic counseling. And then there are some surveys that people can fill out that we're collecting this kind of data, and also kind of medical record requests where we can correlate those pieces of data with the findings as well. So ultimately, we hope this kind of information, starting out with the genetic testing and then correlating it with clinical data, risk factors, kind of what happens over time with these mutations. We hope that will give us enough information to kind of inform screening and prevention and treatment. So that's the study kind of overall. The three cohorts, that was a bit of a long introduction, but so there's three cohorts. One is kind of building on the prior inherit study. So that's the first group of people, and those are either people who know that they have, or they have a relative that has a germline mutation in EGFR, most commonly the T790M mutation that we were talking about, but there are others that we know are related to familial EGFR mutant lung cancer. And if you contact study staff, we'd be happy to review that on a case-by-case basis. So that's number one. Number two are those who have a family history or personal history of lung cancer, and either have themselves or a relative who carries an inherited mutation, not in EGFR, but in kind of a handful of other genes that we were speaking about earlier, like the BRCA genes and ETM, genes like P10 and P53. This is not an exhaustive list. We have a list that the study staff can provide, but that's the second cohort. And then the third group of people are people kind of without a known mutation, but who have what we call strong family histories of lung cancer. And this is a really interesting group because this is a place where we can kind of discover new things that might be, mediating familial lung cancer, but also, evaluate based on family history alone. And, the kind of definition of strong family history can be better explained by our study staff, but basically if you have more than one first-degree relative or multiple generations within one family where there's lung cancer cases, may be eligible for cohort 3 there.
Courtney?
Yeah, so far in Inherit, we have participants, I think, from 42 states, is that correct?
Yep.
As well as Canada and Puerto Rico. We can't, I don't think, get outside of that because of GDPR and other types of health regulations, but I personally find it really exciting that we're able to bring people into this study to get to talk with people who have the expertise, such as Diane, to talk to a genetic counselor.
I mean, this is like the first time we've ever really been able to do a study like this, where we aren't limited by geographic location. And specifically in, genetics-based studies like this, you're really looking to find not super common things. And so specifically, or most specifically in the case of the EGFR T790M mutation, that was really a limitation in the past to find people and families that were affected by this because not everybody could make it to Boston. Having access to Diane's expertise, over 10 years of doing this is just phenomenal for people all over the country to be able to do. And then for the other groups as well, just being able to have people participate in a way that's really meaningful, both to them but also for the field. It's kind of the only way we can make these kind of big leaps forward.
Danielle, if you would be willing to talk a little bit about Inherit and what the study means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also a PSA you can watch afterwards that my sister and I star in on the GoTo site. But really looking and taking a deep dive into the genetics of lung cancer, and this is what I was talking about sort of early on when this meeting first started. My family has been impacted by lung cancer for generations. It started with my great-grandfather, my mom's grandfather, who was diagnosed and died of lung cancer, my mom's mom, as well as my mom's brother and sister, and then my mom. All over the board, insofar as it relates to a smoking history, age at diagnosis, other risk factors, all of that. And I remember when my mom was diagnosed in 2003, first of all, this was all unheard of. I mean, we're talking a lot about EGFR, and we spent the last 20 years talking a lot about EGFR, but back in 2023, it was still, I think, in trials, and my mom's tissue was not even tested for any type of biomarker, and then it was discarded, which also is so sad. But that's one of the reasons I think this is so important to me, and I can't explain enough how easy it is to participate in this study. I'm a firm believer in clinical trials and studies saving lives. I talk to countless people, and I know I've used the word countless multiple times tonight, but I mean, in 20 years, you get to meet a lot of people who are affected by this disease. And, to be able to give them an opportunity to participate in a trial like this, and or just to be able to educate them in general about how important these studies and these trials are. I mean, without people like you participating in these styles and studies, we would have no advancements, right? This study is very easy to participate in. I did have the remote phlebotomist come to my home. It was before work in the morning, and we sat in my kitchen. She was lovely, really good at her job. It was barely anything. She took both of the samples and was on her way, and in fairly short order, I had the results that come to me sent to me. So, I mean, I can't, and I don't know. I mean, I can't express enough how important it is, again, to have all of these generations in my family. And I think about not just myself or my siblings, but my children and my grandchildren now, and how this could potentially affect them down the road. So I know we just kind of glossed over the differences in the three arms, and I think Courtney go to the three cohorts or arms of this study. But I think Courtney's going to talk a little bit about where people can go to learn more about the study and about how to participate.
Well, thank you for sharing your experience and what that's like. I know it's a little different for everybody because we don't know where people are going to be and whether or not they're going to have the same friendly phlebotomist come sit at their kitchen table. But hopefully, we've got good people all over the country. If you're interested in learning more about this, please feel that you can reach out to any of the go-to staff, to Danielle or myself. We would love to talk to you about it. You can also go directly to the Dana-Farber hosted site, which is probably the easiest one to remember, inheritstudy.org. It's a great site. You can learn more also at goto.org, but I think you have to navigate through our research site, but you can find it there and there's more information. The Alchemy site also has information about this study.
What is one thing you most hope people either in this room watching live or folks that will go back and watch live later take away from this conversation tonight?
The fact that there is work being done to understand, prevent, and treat lung cancer from a genetics perspective. I think that would be the thing. There's also one thing I forgot to mention, which is we are in the process of opening a lung cancer genetics clinic at Dana-Farber. Myself and Diane and our wonderful staff at Genetics and Prevention at Dana-Farber. So if you, that should be open in the next couple of months. So if you happen to be in Boston and you're not eligible for Inherit, or if you are, or if you're interested, we'll find ways to get that out there as well.
Great, thank you. Diane, how about you?
I'd probably say that communication with your family about cancer history is really important. We can't identify who's at risk if we don't know what the family history looks like, and we know not everybody shares their health information widely among family members, but when you get opportunities when the family's gathered, it's really important to share health information with each other so that you know what your family history looks like, so that you can then share that with your providers and see if genetic testing might be something that makes sense for you.
And Courtney?
I guess two things from me. Number one, I hope that people will participate in research. There are ways, even if you don't live close to an amazing medical institute like Dana-Farber, such as through our Inherit study and that decentralized approach. And I also just hope that people see that we are learning more every day. That there's a lot of hope and that GoTo is there, actually. And I don't know, Danielle, if you're going to say something along those lines, but we really do want to help people find their way, and we're here for you. So reach out.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, yes. Yes to all of that. I mean, we're here for anyone either diagnosed, caring for someone diagnosed, or concerned about their risk. And I think, again, the helpline number is probably coming up on the bottom of the screens for those watching at home right now, but we've got some information out on the table for anybody in the room. I already met a few of you tonight who said you know who I am because you watched the living room, so thank you guys for that. And I appreciate everyone coming out and allowing us to have this conversation and to bring this very important information to you wherever you are. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe you said it live in the beginning, so I apologize, but I wanted to thank the folks at the Red Sox and Fenway Park for hosting us.
Yeah,
were you getting there?
I did. I was going to
You
do it
did?
again,
Okay.
but I think
I must not have been paying attention in the beginning.
a big, huge thank you.
I mean, this is amazing right now for all of you who are watching this on video. I'm looking at Fenway Park through the windows on the other side. It's pretty incredible. So really appreciate you all hosting us here.
Absolutely. So a huge thank you to you guys. To obviously all of our panelists for coming out and having this conversation with us tonight. All of you in the room, those of you watching live from your own living rooms, and to those of you who will go back and watch this post live, to this production team who got here really early today. They have a big war room in the back for coming in and setting up all these cameras and making sure that we can bring this information to the people that need it live in real time. Thank you so much. Michelle, as always, for all the work that you do to make sure that this programming gets to the people that need it. I don't know why I'm feeling so emotional right now. But most importantly, really, to all of you who have and are participating in clinical trials, like I said before, it's a passion of mine to educate. Sometimes clinical trials even drug trials, not just trials such as these, are the best line of treatment for you at that moment, and you don't know if you're not exploring or looking into them. Another quick plug, Courtney's team works very closely with the support team, and particularly in their lung match, in helping folks to access clinical trials or learn about clinical trials that might be good for them and near to them. And then, of course, our supporters. This is a long list, so I am going to look down the entire time and read this. But without their support, we simply couldn't bring this programming or all of the other free programming services and education that we do to the lung cancer community. So Amgen, AstraZeneca, Bayer, Boehringer, Ingelheim, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Daiichi Sankyo, Eisai, Foundation Medicine, Genentech, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Mirati Therapeutics, Novartis, Novacure, I know you're in the room, Regeneron, Sanofi, and Takeda also in the room. Thank you all for your support. And till next time, guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're